I want to get some more perspective now on some of what you just heard and Canada's posture towards China from three MPs with me this evening. Liberal MP Tlaib Noor Mohammed, Conservative Foreign Affairs critic Michael Chong, and NDP Deputy International Trade critic Daniel Blakey. Hello all of you. Nice to see you. Very much appreciate you making the time. Mr. Noor Mohammed, I'll start with you. We heard from Secretary Hagel there the question of whether what happened with the spy balloon is a quote-unquote new accelerant from China, which has already obviously been aggressive towards both the U.S. and Canada. In your government's view, is this a new accelerant?
Well, I think what we've seen, Vassy, over the last number of years is a change in how China is dealing with the world. And so we have, I think, been responsive to that in rethinking that relationship. The launch of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, was precisely that, recognition that China was going to be behaving differently and that it was important for us to recalibrate and reorient that relationship. And so it should really be of no surprise, as the Secretary said, that they are trying different things and different ways of undermining, in many ways, the relationship.
The new Indo-Pacific strategy, yes, determines or characterizes China as an adversary. But in this specific instance, the U.S. has already reacted to that spy balloon by banning 6 Chinese companies, essentially putting them on an export blacklist. Will your government follow suit, and why hasn't it already?
I think what we're going to do is to continue to look at the facts, data as it comes in, and make decisions. We have not been slow to respond. Quite the opposite. I think the measures that we're going to take, or we will take, will be ones that are thoughtful and responsive to the nature of the relationship that we have with China and aware of the consequences of rash decision making.
So, I mean, it's not rash. It's been, 10 days since the balloon was shot down. Mm-hmm. The U.S. days ago determined that this was an appropriate response because those 6 companies are tied to the spy balloon program. Is your government prepared to do the same?
I think we need to, as I said before, we need to see what the implications are for Canada, and I'm sure that Minister Champagne and others will make those decisions in due course.
Mr. Chong, your party has continually said to the federal government that they should specifically zero in on universities and the collaboration that has taken place with what's known as the National University of Defense Technology, basically Chinese military scientists. Those collaborations began in 2005. Conservatives were in power from 2005 to 2011. Why didn't you put an end to it then?
Well, China of 2005 wasn't the China of today. China of 2005 to 2015 was governed by a different premier and president, President Hu and Premier Wen. They had a very different approach to China's place in the world than the China of the last decade, which has been headed up by a president, President Xi, who has taken China into an unprecedented era of authoritarianism and has been belligerently threatening both neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region and democracies like Canada. And so that's quite simply the reason why. But it became clear about 5 or 6 years ago that China had changed and that Canada needed to listen to our experts in the intelligence and military communities and take a decision against funding research in partnership with Beijing's military. It was in 2018 that CSIS Director David Vigneault publicly said in a very public speech that Beijing presented a threat in 5 areas of sensitive research to our national security, a threat to our intellectual property, those areas being telecommunications, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biopharma, and clean technology. But the government has ignored those very clear warnings from about 5 years ago from CSIS and has failed to issue a ministerial order banning research collaboration with this National University of Defense Technology.
And I take your point on the ministerial order. I know we spoke about that last time. Just to challenge you for a moment, yes, China is very different in the last 6 years, but they were not free from human rights abuses before. I think, for example, of what happened with Tibet. I look back at Human Rights Watch all the way back to 2002 and the reporting that they had done on not only what was going on with the Uyghurs, but sort of the suppression of any dissidents was quite extensive. Yes, it's not exactly what happened in the last 6 years, but it was present. There were security concerns around conservatives handing over, for example, Nexon to CNOC. Yep. All of that was very much part of the calculation. I know you're very critical of this government for going easy on China, but your government was too.
Well, okay, so first off, the assumptions that underpinned Western governments' approach to China a decade and more ago were very different. We assumed after the fall of the Berlin Wall that by increasing trade and investment with authoritarian states like China and Russia, by increasing collaboration, by broadening and deepening ties, that we could also gradually improve their human rights record, the record on the rule of law, and on democracy. Clearly, that has been proven false. And we came to that realization about 5 or 6 years ago. The invasion of Russia by Ukraine on February 24th of last year just further drove home that point. So it's long past time for the government to wake up and realize that this National University of Defense Technology, a People's Liberation Army university, is directly funding research of surveillance-type balloons. And we cannot be, as a federal government, partnering in that research. And that collaboration should end immediately.
Mr. Blakey, last week your colleague, Lindsay Matheson, who's the party's critic on this file, on defense, sat in your seat. And I asked her about the same thing, whether we should kind of be taking a more punitive stance towards China, specifically around these sensitive areas. And she wanted to wait for proof from the balloon before making that determination. Is that your party's official stance? Has China not sort of established a record of performance here that would require, not that proof now that the Pentagon has said there's a giant spy balloon program happening?
I mean, I think Canada at this point has a lot of reason to be skeptical of China's motives and to think seriously about how we want to respond to that. I think when we take the Huawei example, for instance, on 5G, the government really took a very long time in making decisions. And I think what we need to be doing is seeing the government take decisions more quickly when it comes to issues like this. As a fourth party, we don't have the same information that the government has access to. And I think Canadians feel that what they want to see from government is some clear pronouncements on how they intend to engage with China in the new context. I think there is a feeling that things have been changing, and we can have the historical debate sometime about how New Democrats evaluated the theory at the time that deepening trade relationships with governments that were still authoritarian and still guilty of massive human rights violations, whether that was going to work or not. But that's a historical debate. Today, it's clear that the posture towards China has to change to some degree, and I think Canadians are looking to their government for leadership on that.
But I'm asking what your party's official position is. Do you think, for example, that we should be issuing a ministerial directive like they did under the Obama administration to cut off the university's relationships with scientists who essentially work for China's military?
Well, we were supportive of the idea of keeping Huawei out of the 5G network because we felt that there was a case there, and I think the government needs to be forthright with Canadians about.
But do you feel there's a case here after following what happened with this spy balloon? Or are you still, like your colleague, waiting for proof?
Well, what I'm waiting for is a clear position from the government on what they think should go ahead. We've heard from the Conservatives, and as I say, I mean, we're not privy to the kind of information.
But you have seen what China's done, right? We can hear what the Pentagon says about this balloon. We know what they did with Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Like, is there really that much to question?
Well, I think the question is what's the nature and extent of Canada's approach and what's reasonable in the circumstances. So what we don't want to see, for instance, is an escalation of rhetoric that will contribute to the kind of thing that I think Mr. Hagel was alluding to as well, that people come out of the gate really quick with strong opinions and it sets a political tone that's escalatory. So I think we should be careful in our rhetoric. The job of response is ultimately the job of the government with the information they have. I think what the U.S. has done is a strong sign that our government should be taking the kind of suggestions that Michael's making very seriously. I'm certainly open to that. New Democrats are open to that. But are we the ones to make that decision with all the diplomatic implications that come with that? No, we respect we're not. But I do want to hear more from the government than we've heard. I think Canadians are feeling like the response has been tepid. And it's up to the government, as it was with Huawei, to come out with a real position that can be evaluated instead of waiting for years while our allies get around to figuring out their position.
I apologize. I have to cut it off. I'm out of time. The producers wants me to go to break, so I got to leave it there. Talib Nur Mohammed, Michael Chong, and Daniel Blakey, thank you very much for your time this evening.